Hi, my name is Debra R. Richardson of Debra R. Richardson LLC, and I work with you to help you clean up your vendor data, clean up your vendor processes so that you pay the right vendor. Now, this week's Vendor Master File tip of the week is make sure this one step is done if for accounts payable or AP if purchasing owns the vendor master file. And let me just add here before we get started that one of the reasons that purchasing may own the vendor master file, amongst others, because there could be other reasons as well, is the segregation or separation of duties because no one team member should be able to create a vendor, generate a purchase order, um, post an invoice, and then also issue a payment, with three of those being done in accounts payable. So if procurement or purchasing owns the vendor master file, which probably happens about 30% of the time, then that segregation of duties or separation of duties is mitigated. So let's look at what purchasing focuses on if they own the vendor master file. So the first of three, and I have three of the focus areas for purchasing is strategic vendors. And this is really important because strategic vendors are those vendors that purchasing have negotiated a rate for, delivery for, and this really does two things. It decreases the number of vendors in your vendor master file because you don't have internal employees going off and kind of identifying their own vendors with that could have like different terms or different costs. And so they're using the strategic vendors, so it decreases the number of active vendors in your vendor master file, which is always good because that decreases fraud. And then the second thing it does is it keeps the cost down because you don't have multiple vendors with varying costs for the same thing. All internal team members are using these strategic vendors that have those negotiated rates. And the second thing that purchasing focuses on is contact information, that email and fax number. And I know there are still some of you out there that have fax numbers for your vendors because those purchase orders, once they are created, can automatically be sent to the vendor either by email or by fax. And so they want to make sure, purchasing wants to make sure that that information is always on file. And I will tell you that as a practitioner, we originally gave purchasing access to the contact page in our accounting system, our ERP, so that they can update that information. Now, we subsequently removed it as part of least privilege access because we didn't want anyone besides the vendor team to have access to add or edit the vendor record. But initially they did have access, and that was so that they could update that email and fax and be able to ensure that the purchase orders, once generated, would automatically be sent to the vendors. And then the last thing is payment terms, right? Purchasing or procurement is always interested in making sure that they keep that supplier or vendor relationship good. And one of the best ways to do that is make sure you're paying them in accordance with their payment terms or negotiated payment terms. There's nothing worse than set up a vendor with default payment terms when they have a negotiated payment terms that is sooner than your default, because you're going to get an angry vendor or supplier contacting you back. So you want to make sure that the payment terms are always based on negotiated or contracted rates. And not to say that any of those three things are not good, they are not important, they are all important. But these focus areas, and probably many more, are all really focused on costs and supplier relationships, which in itself is important, but there's still one other thing that we need, actually more than one other thing, but at least one other critical thing that accounts payable needs to have done as well. And so when accounts payable owns a vendor master file, one of the critical focus areas that not necessarily purchasing has, but Accounts Payable has is that IRS 10 match. And why is that? That is because AP typically is responsible for distributing and filing 1099s and 1042s. And that is a direct result a direct result of having an inaccurate legal name and tax ID combination, is that the IRS can assess penalties, and the accounts payable team may have to go through that terribly manual and time-consuming B-notice process where they have to reach out to the vendors. And so where I don't see that it's always a focus when procurement owns the vendor master file is collecting that W-9. And even when they do collect it, that IRS 10 match may not always be done. And so if you are procurement, or if you are AP, make sure that procurement knows that the IRS 10 match must be done, and you must collect the IRS W-9 or W-8 for that matter if a foreign vendor has an IRS tax ID. Make sure those forms are collected, and then also make sure that IRS 10 match is done. If you'd like more information on how to improve your vendor process, please go to my website at debrarrichardson.com for free tools and resources to avoid fraud, regulatory fines, and just overall bad vendor data. So good luck, and be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell to be notified next Tuesday for the next Vendor Master File tip of the week.